what are some of the common complaints about the boss that you hear? And maybe some advice given to the employee on how they can approach the boss if they're frustrated about certain things. What advice would you give if someone is complaining that their boss is a micromanager?
I guess my approach would be to have a conversation with the boss about expectations and about style, and to ask about the expectations of the particular work that's going on, and to ensure that there's clarity about what's expected, and then it hopefully that turns into a conversation about roles. So how often would you like an update, or what's the timing of the updates? What sort of involvement do you want or would you like in the project, and to try to set those, I guess, expectations about the work relationship. If there's already a complaint about a micromanager, there's already behaviors that are showing up for the individual, and so that could turn into an opportunity in that conversation for feedback as well.
There's got to be a reason, unless I'm totally wrong, that the boss feels they need to micromanage in the first place, right? And so to try to open the dialogue with that manager as the employee to say, here's what I'm seeing. You want me to copy you on all the emails that I send and make sure you're included in all the meetings that I attend and whatever. Because I've been on the receiving end of this. I have been a micromanaged in my career in the past, and it's very difficult. And so to try to understand what is at the root of that need to micromanage, I think is really important.
So you made a good point, Stephanie, when you said find out what's at the root. So I would absolutely start a conversation with my boss to say, what is it that you're concerned about related to what I'm working on?
Mhm.
So what are your greatest fears? Because sometimes it's an absolute eye opener that you don't have the full picture as an employee. And once your boss can share what their fear is, then that helps you to understand what are those key times that you have to go
Mm.
back to the boss to make sure that they're in that loop. Because sometimes, there is a disconnect. You can't get into your boss's head. And if they're not a good communicator, they might not share with you why they feel like they have to have, a greater finger on the pulse of the work that you're doing. I think opening up the dialogue, like you said, and actually asking what are their concerns about the end results of the project or throughout the project would definitely help.
I think understanding their communication cadence as well, because if you're providing your updates on Thursday and their updates are on Wednesday morning, you're going to get tons of questions on Monday and Tuesday, right? So, asking that up front and kind of understanding when they need certain milestones and when they need communication around where those milestones are, I think that helps make it a little bit easier too. I've been on that receiving end too, Stephanie, and sometimes it's just difficult to find the right cadence, but asking questions seems to always help.
What about the opposite? So what if you have a boss that tends to be more of a visionary and is always up in the clouds with these great ideas, but is not organized at all. So, it's kind of all over the place. And you're trying to navigate your work with a boss that is very scattered. What advice would you have in dealing with that kind of a boss? I'm going to give you a real business case scenario that happened to me. And we used to call my boss the nutty professor. And brilliant, brilliant man, absolutely brilliant. And every time I'd sit in front of him, I walked away with such great information and thought about, how we could do things differently to positively impact the business. But I used to have to take a deep breath every time I had meetings with him, or we had a corporate meeting that we both had to, lead the agenda. He was brilliant, but he was the type of man where he'd get out of the cab in New York City at least once a week, and his assistant was having to call the cab company because he inevitably left his wallet or his briefcase or something in that cab. When I would leave meetings with him, I literally would chase after him and I'd pick up everything that was on the table or on his chair, right? So I'd have to pick up all of the papers. I'd have to grab his briefcase, his raincoat, whatever. And I would, have the armful. And it would get me very frustrated because, like, why is he doing this? Is he doing this on purpose? But what I realized is that he just was not an organized man.
I don't think I've worked for anyone that has like been scattered, but definitely a visionary and somewhat the opposite of micromanager in the sense that I barely heard from him. And so to try to navigate, whether I was doing a good job or how he preferred me to communicate with him, was a challenge at the time. And I remember going into his office for a review, which really quite honestly never happened, because what he said to me was, keep doing what you're doing. If you're ever doing what you're not supposed to, then I'll let you know. But I mean, he was very hands off as a manager. And that became a little bit of a challenge for me as his employee at the time to try to navigate as well.
Yeah, I've had that experience too, where I went from being micromanaged to that kind of boss, and then back to something more structured. And it was like this 4-year transition of, oh my gosh, how do I do this? And you try one style and then you try to fix another one, and it was like, okay, this just is not working. But it was hard to like keep that being ahead of what they were going to ask for on your top of mind, and really listening to updates and meetings and so forth to kind of figure out, okay, how does my business fit into this so I could showcase my team? Because if you can't figure that out, you're really struggling to showcase your worth and your team's worth, which is important.
As someone who is, I'm pretty conscientious. And so when I've had experiences where I'm working with supervisors or bosses that are not very conscientious and they don't have that structure, I'll create the structure. And usually they appreciate it to where like I will request that we have a weekly touch base meeting, and then I'll come to that meeting with my own little agenda of points that I want to make sure we get to so that we don't go on a tangent 2 minutes into the meeting and never get to, the project updates. And so if the boss isn't creating that accountability or outlining those expectations clearly, then the employee, could have some bandwidth to do that themselves.
In my coaching experience, had a lot with employees talking about their leaders who are, they call it the seagull method, right? They come in and they drop something and then they fly away, right? And completely agree that there's the opportunity for the employee to take more of that responsibility for setting up the structure. So instead of complaining about never seeing the boss or never hearing from the boss, Paige, to your point, you put the employee puts together the structure, right, and provides the updates without being prompted to provide the updates, and ask for feedback from a standpoint of, is this the depth that you're looking for? Is this the frequency? Those sorts of things. But that, back to the beginning, that's where a lot of complaints that I've heard from employees is that my boss is never around. I never hear from my boss.
And to piggyback on that, back to what we were talking about before in regards to having regular one-on-ones, one of the complaints that I would get is that the boss is constantly canceling those one-on-ones, or they're making them excruciatingly short so that you don't feel like as an employee you can really get out everything that you want to talk about. And so my advice has been, stick to those schedules, try not to, because you're sending a very loud message as a supervisor, as a boss, when you're not bothering to respect, I suppose, the time that's been allotted for those meetings with your employee.
It's often not about the boss purposely saying, I don't want to spend time, or I don't respect this person. What it's often about is that the boss is caught up in his or her own work, right? And really doesn't understand the impact that they have on their employees by not being present or by not connecting. And so that relationship and that feedback of, this is really important. It's really important not only for the work and the project, but for my connection to the organization as well. It's usually not intentional, but it doesn't matter if it's intentional or not. It's the impact that it has on the employees.
What about the boss that is just not a good communicator? So, a very common complaint that we hear often from employees is that I didn't understand what the big picture was. My boss didn't communicate with me what was happening. I did all of this work and I should have been going in another direction. I don't know what's going on within the organization. So a very common complaint that I hear is that the boss is not a good communicator. What would you advise in that case and how to manage your boss?
I think again, you have to be really curious and ask questions because, they probably have the knowledge, but if you're not asking the question, they may not be thinking about sending it to you. So I think, asking those questions, what's the big picture? When you're doing your update, is this still the direction we want to go? Should we be looking at any other options? Have you heard about new things that might tie into this, and kind of prompting that communication so that they think about it. A lot of times, being in safety, I've reported to people who safety isn't necessarily their forte. It's just kind of something that was added onto their job, but they don't necessarily think about, how something going on in the security world or something going on in the finance world would affect safety. But I'll know that because I have that background. So I'll ask lots of questions about the other areas that they oversee to try to connect the dots. And so that usually helps me, especially if they're not, a lot of times it's not even their communication skills. It's just they don't think about it because why would that affect safety? And then they're like, oh, wow, I do see that connection.
If I know my boss was in a specific meeting for the week, when I meet with the boss, I might say, hey, how did that meeting go? Is there anything that came out of that meeting that I might need to know about? So that's, a question that I typically like to ask if I know my boss isn't a good communicator. The other one that I routinely ask is, are there any priority changes that I should be aware of? If not, I'm going to stay the course. And here are the top 2 things that I'm working on over the next couple of weeks.
Maybe role modeling, right? The type of communication that you're looking for from your boss, and being able to say, I want to make sure I'm keeping up to speed on things, and checking in on occasion. I'd like to meet every couple of weeks, and I'm going to send you emails or text updates, and just role model for your boss, right? How you expect communication to happen, and maybe there's a hope there that your boss is going to pick it up and begin to respond.
So if you're a human resources representative, or you're a senior leader and you're getting complaints from employees regarding a specific boss, what are some of the actions that you would advise that leaders take when that happens?
The first thing I always do is ask the person who's complaining to share the feedback, and then I help them to prepare how to share the feedback in a constructive way with the boss.
An employee, if they feel like the boss says, you never tell me exactly what you want from me. So what kind of constructive, conversation can I have with them is maybe helping them able to phrase it in a certain way. Maybe you seem to have in your mind exactly what you want from me. It would be helpful to tell me to avoid unproductive time.